Hi, I'm here again, and this time I want to talk about one of the important limitations of immunoassays, specifically something that occurs in one-step sandwich ELISA. Before I start, I want to briefly explain the one-step sandwich ELISA system. In this system, an antibody which is called capture antibody is coated on the surface of microtiter plate, and then the sample and secondary antibody, which is called labeled antibody, are added. After incubation and washing step, substrate chromogen are added and incubated for a while. Then after reaction is stopped by using hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, and then is read by ELISA reader instrument. Thus, that was a brief explanation of one-step sandwich ELISA. Okay, back to our main topic. Hook effect. I want to talk about hook effect. Hook effect that gives falsely low results as a consequence of high concentration of analyte in the sample. When the amount of analyte is low, by low I mean it is within the reportable range of the assay. Here is the reportable range. In this area, our signal is proportional to the analyte concentration. In fact, there is a linear relationship between the signal strength and the analyte concentration. But as the concentration of analyte increases, for example, in some samples that we have a very, very high amount of analyte, you see from here the shape of our curve changes in a maximum point in which there is an optimal ratio of capture antibody and antigen concentration. But as the concentrations become very, very high, signal falls and doesn't give us the actual signal which is relevant to the real concentration of analyte. Here curve shape changes and we see a hook-like or bell shape in this area. We see the hook effect. This is the concentration that can't be measured by the assay, and in ELISA system only occurs in one-step sandwich ELISAs, in which the analyte of interest and secondary antibody or detector antibody are added at the same time. They're added simultaneously. Besides, here there is an excessive amount of analyte. This excessive antigen concentration will saturate binding sites of capture antibody. As you see here, the binding sites are saturated by the analyte, and so we still have some free analyte in the reaction environment, which in turn binds to the detector antibodies, and as a result there aren't enough detector antibody to bind to our complex on the surface of plate. I mean the complex of a capture antibody and the analyte. Till now it was first step for reaction on the microtiter plate surface. During the wash step, unbound detection antibodies are washed away from the reaction environment, and after adding chromogen substrate, if there is any complex including capture antibody, analyte, and secondary antibody, we see the signal, but as I mentioned before, it's not representing the real concentration of analyte and gives falsely low results. What happens here? The signal that is caught is lower than the actual signal, and so the concentration is not real. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanism that happens during this phase of our curve, this phase, and finally this phase. Here the amount of analyte is lower than the binding capacity of our capture antibody, so we can detect it easily and with no problem. As you see here, the analyte is lower than the binding capacity of a capture antibody and detector antibody. This area is called the equivalence zone. In equivalence zone, there is an optimal ratio of capture antibody and antigen, and as you see here, the detector antibody can easily bind to the antigen and the signal is captured, but as you see, there is a straight line and it's flattened because the concentration is roughly constant, and you can't get any different concentration in this area. After this phase, the phase which is called hook effect, the analyte is much higher than the binding capacity of capture, and also this time detector antibody. As you see, free analyte binds to binding sites of detector antibody, and there is no more binding site in order to bind to the complex including capture antibody and analyte, and so the signal that you get from here is much lower than the actual signal. So that was the mechanisms that happens during the making this. So now whenever we face such phenomenon, what do we do? In fact, first step is to dilute the patient sample and testing both undiluted and diluted sample, and if diluted sample shows much higher results than undiluted one, hook effect is suspected, and what we must do is to make a serial dilution of sample to get the real concentrations. And another time, I want to remind you that this phenomenon happens in only in one-step sandwich ELISA systems. And at the end, for getting the real concentration, you have to multiply the concentration in which there is no overmax, this area, and you have a concentration which is an ascending trend. For example, in 10% dilution to 20% to 30% dilution, you see that there is an ascending trend from a lower concentration to a higher, and it's gradual. In a concentration or in a dilution that after that you see an overmax, and the ELISA reader read it as overmax. This dilution, for example, it is 30% or 40% dilution. You have a concentration. It is real, and it's in the limitation of your reportable range. You have to multiply that dilution by the dilution factor, and then the result is your real concentration. That's all, and I hope this video was useful for you, and thank you for your attention. Goodbye.